Hey, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar, Demystifying Mechanistic Research Concepts That You Need to Know. And before I introduce our speakers for today, just a reminder that at the end of the presentation or during the presentation, if you have questions, we would ask that you put them into the Q&A tab and not into the chat. That'll make it easier for us to facilitate those questions at the end. Other than that, I think we are ready to go. So it's my honor to introduce our speakers today. We have Dr. Patrick Finan. Um, he's a clinical pain psychologist and the Harold Karen Professor of Anesthesiology at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. And his lab focuses broadly on explicating psychological and neurobiological mechanisms of chronic pain. And within this domain, his team specifically seeks to identify how emotions and pain interact, and when changes in emotions facilitate or inhibit the experiences of pain. Also today we have Dr. Mathieu Roy. He is a neuropsychologist and assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at McGill University. His research is at the forefront of understanding how the brain encodes the subjective experience of pain and uses various psychophysical and brain imaging techniques to elucidate central nervous system mediators of pain-reducing interventions, including music. So we're thrilled to have you both with us today, and I'll let you take it from here.
Yes, thank you, Sherry, for the very nice introduction. And thank you, everyone, for attending our webinar on demystifying mechanistic research. So, as you may know, our Music for Pain research network was created. Oh, sorry, was created. Oops. Okay. Our Music for Pain Research Network was created a couple of years ago to advance mechanistic research on music-induced hypoalgesia. And in order to do that, we do all sorts of things. So we have these webinars with you today. We also have a registry of researchers and clinicians who are interested in research on pain. And we also have pilot funding for stimulating mechanistic research on the effects of music on pain. And of course, one important criterion for these pilot fund applications is that the research has to be mechanistic in nature. And so we thought that it could be a good opportunity today to define a little bit more precisely what we mean by mechanistic research, and also try to explain a little bit more why we think it is important to do it. First, mechanistic research has to be distinguished from efficacy research. So Patrick will also come back to this in his presentation, but very briefly, every efficacy research asks the question, does a given treatment works? So typically you're going to compare your treatment, so it could be music intervention to no intervention or to treatment as usual. And you're going to want to know, is it better than doing nothing? And you're also going to be interested by the magnitude of the effect. So how well is this treatment working? So efficacy research is very useful for knowing whether or not a certain treatment is worth it. Are the effects strong enough to be used in practice? It is absolutely essential for establishing evidence-based interventions. It is the starting point. The first thing that we need to know is whether a given treatment is working. But once that's done, we may move to more mechanistic research where we ask the question, how does the treatment work? So in mechanistic research, we're going to be interested in identifying the active ingredients of a given treatment. What in music, for instance, is causing pain reductions. So typical questions in mechanistic research on music could be something like which musical features contribute most to analgesia, or what are the psychological and neurobiological mechanisms that are involved in the effects of music on pain. So here we define mechanism very loosely. It can be a psychological phenomenon, reduction of stress, distraction. It can be neurological activity in a certain brain region. We can look at inflammation. It could be social. You can feel more connected to the therapist or to other people. It can be many things, but what's important is really the type of question that you are going to be asking. If you're wondering, if you're trying to understand how music works, how music reduces pain, then your research protocol, if it's designed correctly, probably is mechanistic. So many types of mechanisms can be included. What's important is the type of question that you ask. We've recently completed a scoping review of mechanistic research on the effects of music on pain. It's going to be published soon in Pain Reports. And we found that there are only 57 studies that can be considered mechanistic that have been published on the effects of music on pain. By contrast, there are several hundreds of studies that have proven the efficacy of music-based interventions for pain reduction. So as I said, efficacy studies are absolutely necessary and important, but we feel that by now we have a pretty good idea that music is an effective intervention, and we should start to understand a little bit more about the mechanisms, about how music reduces pain. All right, so should clinician care about mechanisms? Why should clinician care about mechanisms? So that's a question that we often have, and it's a good question, and it's a question that is not that easy to answer. So I'm going to take a little bit of time in my presentation to try to answer that question. Before I start, I just want to point out that I'm trained as a clinician. Patrick is also trained as a clinician. So we have a foot in both world, so to speak. Of course, as a researcher, we are intrinsically curious about mechanisms, right? We like to understand why things work the way they do, but there are also very important practical application of that type of mechanistic knowledge. All right, so should clinicians care about mechanisms? The short answer is not necessarily all the time. As I said, efficacy studies are what's really necessary to prove that a certain treatment is efficient and should be used. So, as long as you have support from efficacy studies, you are warranted as a clinician to use that treatment. The problem is that it is a very minimal requirement, and very often clinical decisions are complex and will require some flexibility. So, for instance, knowing that, if you have a certain type of patient, you should administer a certain type of treatment, very, very soon, this knowledge is going to be limited and difficult to apply because patients are complex. It's difficult to put them in a little cell, and this will, complicate your clinical decision. So, for instance, maybe you have a given patient that has a certain condition where a certain treatment has proven to be most effective, but that patient also has other characteristics that make them more prone to suffer from the side effects of that particular treatment. And in that case, you're going to prefer another type of treatment that doesn't have the side effect of the first treatment that should be most efficient for that patient, right? So we have to be flexible. We have to have a deeper understanding of the situation in order to make these complicated decisions. And so beyond just efficacy, what we need to have to make these difficult decisions is an explanatory model of what's going on, of how, for instance, music may reduce pain. And mechanistic research is what allows us to build these explanatory models and to test their veracity. All right, so why understanding mechanisms matter? Well, it could be dangerous to use some models that are wrong or erroneous. And unfortunately, history is full of horrific examples of what science can do when it goes wrong. Here, I'm going to use a more recent example, a Canadian example of a doctor who's prescribed massive doses of antibiotics for prolonged periods of time, several weeks, sometimes several months, to treat so-called chronic Lyme disease. So we see him, he's very famous in Quebec because he's also a politician. So Dr. Amir Kaderi is a microbiologist. We see him with his wife here, who's an epidemiologist. So very, very smart people. But at some point, he started prescribing these prolonged doses of antibiotics to treat chronic Lyme disease. And the model that he was using was the idea that persistent symptoms following Lyme disease are caused by an ongoing infection. So in other terms, the bacteria still remains in the body, but it's hidden. And the problem with that kind of model is that it's very difficult to falsify, right? So if you cannot find the bacteria in the body, it's because it's hiding, right? And so you're confirming your model by not finding the bacteria. If the antibiotics cause substantial side effects, then this may be interpreted as evidence that the treatment is working because the bacteria are fighting back, and so on and so forth. So in that case, there were many things that were wrong with his model, which caused him to break the Hippocratic oath and cause harm to his patients, even though it surely started from a very good intent. I think he really wanted to try to do what was best for his patients, was convinced that this was the right way to go, didn't want to wait for more evidence that this was working because he was confronted with these patients that needed immediate treatment. And so he decided to take a risk without confronting his model with scientific data. So very well, now and then I hear people saying, well, I don't really need science to prove me that, this or that treatment is working. I know it's working. And every time I hear that, I get a little bit worried because, right, we all want things to, work a certain way, but reality is more complex, and research forces us to remain humble in our capacities to treat patients. All right, so that was a little bit of a depressing example. On the bright side, mechanistic research can really help accelerate discoveries. So a good example is with opioids. So I know that we've been through a rough patch with opioids, but the reason I am using this example is because they've been used for a very, very long time, right? So for millennia, their efficacy has been demonstrated. But when we began to understand a little bit more how they were working, we were able to make substantial progress in a relatively short period of time. So, for instance, at the beginning of the 19th century, we were able to isolate morphine within opium. And that really helped with standardized dosing, also helped increase the potency of the analgesia, and also allowed for more precise treatment. In the 70s, we discovered the different types of opioid receptors, which allowed us to identify the endogenous opioids that bind to these receptors, and that allowed us to produce different drugs that would selectively activate the different receptors. And it also opened new avenues for our understanding of pain and pain modulation. So, for instance, that's what allowed us eventually to understand that placebo effects, for instance, rely on endogenous opioids. All right, so now I would like to talk a little bit more about uh, what we mean by explanatory model, and also what's referred to as a depth of knowledge in philosophy of science. So what we see here on the top left is the very simple and quote unquote shallow knowledge that we get from efficacy studies. Okay, so for instance, music reduces pain, and we can demonstrate this over and over and over again. And the problem with that, as I've said, is that it doesn't allow us to be very flexible, right? So we're sort of like stuck in a loop, constantly demonstrating that music reduces pain. However, if we try to go deeper and ask mechanistic questions, how does music reduce pain? Then you can see that our knowledge gets deeper and deeper and expands and gets connected to other parts of knowledge. So, for instance, here in this example, the sort of like conceptual map that we see on the left examines the possibility that the effects of music on pain could be mediated by the fact that music increases pleasure, pleasure increases dopamine, and dopamine reduces pain. So it's a simple model, maybe right, maybe wrong. But what's interesting is that once we have that model, we can make connections that were not necessarily obvious to begin with, right? So, for instance, if we are able to show that it's the pleasure induced by music that is responsible for its effects, then we can make the connection that, okay, well, maybe that means that music acts on pain a little bit like other pleasure-inducing stimuli would, for instance, food or sex, or maybe not, right? But this is an interesting question we can ask. Or if we show that dopamine is involved, then that would suggest that music acts a little bit in the same way that a drug that produces dopamine, like and L-Dopa, would, right? So what's interesting here is that by going deeper and trying to identify mechanisms, we can make new connections that we couldn't necessarily do before. And yeah, and that's the scientific way of handling an idea, right? So we constantly, try to connect it with other concepts and to expose it to observation. And that's how we develop these explanatory models that are so important for us to make these complex clinical decisions. I see a couple of advantages of building these types of explanatory models in the context of the effects of music on pain. The first one is that this model or this process of successively testing hypotheses within models will provide us with a more critical perspective on the effects of music on pain, right? It will allow us to exclude wrong or non-scientific explanations that cannot be falsified. It will also suggest novel ways by which musical interventions can be improved, right? So as we get deeper and deeper and deeper in this model, we'll be able to make new connections. And finally, I think it will also increase our confidence that the effects of music are not just due to placebo effect or report bias by testing other variables in that model that are not self-report. Okay, so to try to connect the effects of music to as many different kinds of data that we can to really, really try to build a strong and solid explanatory model. All right, so before handing it to Patrick, I just want to go briefly over the experimental method that is the gold standard for trying to identify mechanism. So I'll go very rapidly. We're planning to have another webinar that will go over all of the different types of control conditions that we can use. Now I really just want to highlight the general logic behind the experimental method. So the basic logic is that in order to demonstrate the causal role for a certain mechanism, the best way is to compare your experimental condition, so for instance, your music intervention, to a control condition, okay, that is very, very, very similar to your experimental manipulation minus the hypothesized mechanism, okay? And by comparing the effects of these two conditions, if you observe a difference, you're able to conclude that the difference is due to the hypothesized mechanism that is present in one condition and absent in the control condition. So a good example, again with endogenous opioids, is the seminal study done by Levine, where they showed that naloxone blocks placebo analgesia. So naloxone is an antagonist of opioid receptors, and when you administer naloxone, it impairs the effects of opioids, exogenous or endogenous. So here in their study, in the experimental condition, participants were exposed to certain expectations about treatment efficacy. So they thought that they were receiving a treatment that was efficient to reduce pain. In reality, they were administered placebo pills, inert pills, but they were expecting the treatment to be efficient. And in the experimental condition, they didn't receive naloxone, so their opioid receptors were functional. In the control condition, the participants received the same expectations of treatment efficacy, but in that condition, the opioids receptors were blocked by naloxone. And Levine observed that doing that abolished placebo analgesia. So there was no longer a difference between the placebo condition and the baseline condition. And by comparing these two conditions, Levine was able to conclude that endogenous opioids contribute to placebo analgesia because the only thing that differs between the two conditions is the fact that in one case, the opioid receptors are functional, and the other case, they're blocked, and blocking them also blocks placebo analgesia. So the same type of logic can be used to study music. However, with music, sometimes it may be difficult to find an appropriate control condition. Okay, so it's not as easy as administering an inert pill, as in placebo research. So for instance, here, what we have on the left here is the example of a study that would be comparing music versus white noise to show that the mechanism behind the effects of music on pain is pleasure. The fact that music is pleasurable versus white noise isn't. However, the problem with that is that the two conditions, music and white noise, will differ on many other different aspects beyond pleasure. So probably music will be more pleasurable than white noise, but also has a different timbre, also has a different pitch. So of course I'm playing a little bit devil's advocate here, but there are many things that differ between the two conditions that don't perfectly isolate the hypothesized mechanism, which is pleasure here. So one solution that Patrick will expand a little bit more on is the use of mediators in our model. So here in that particular example, one thing that we could do is ask people to also rate how much pleasure they experience in the music condition versus the white noise condition, and put those pleasure ratings in a mediation model to show that the effects of music versus white noise on pain ratings is mediated by the effects of music on pleasure. So the idea is that music increases pleasure and pleasure reduces pain. So by using mediators, we can compensate for a control condition that doesn't perfectly control for all aspects of music minus the hypothesized mechanism. That's all for me. Thank you for your attention, and I'll hand it over to Patrick.
Right. Awesome. Here we go. Thanks, Mathieu. That was great. Let me share my slides. Hold on one second here. Okay. Okay, are you seeing the slides now? Is it in?
It's a small window.
All right,
It's not the full.
How about now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So great. Mathieu just teed up this discussion really nicely. Appreciate that overview. I'm going to kind of go back and just revisit some of these dichotomies that were raised in the beginning about efficacy research versus mechanism research. And then we'll lead into a little quiz where we'll kind of present some case examples and see what you guys think and sort of walk through them ourselves. Right, to sort of get down to the fundamentals, efficacy research asks the question, does it work? Mechanism research asks why or how does it work? As you can, in this kind of graphic, I think this sort of visualizes to some extent what we're doing with these two different types of research designs. In efficacy work, we kind of skip over this middle section, right? We just go straight to this question of does it work? And with mechanisms, we can target a whole host of intermediate variables, and we're never going to be able to target all of the potential intermediate variables, particularly for complex interventions like music interventions. But the importance of thinking about mechanism early in the treatment development process is essentially that it's going to save, I think, a lot of time in the grand arc of trying to get to delivering treatments that work effectively for specific groups of people. And we can think about if we take a look at, for example, psychosocial interventions for pain, and sort of look historically on how they've kind of evolved over time. We have a host of interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy for pain, acceptance and commitment therapy, and mindfulness-based stress reduction. They probably are the three psychosocial intervention frameworks that enjoy probably the greatest level of evidence. But these intervention classes have essentially produced largely the same effect sizes across studies, and we've seen this now in meta-analyses now that we're decades into this work. And a number of folks started to question, if we're seeing essentially the same effect sizes, despite intervention frameworks that are ostensibly different, what does this mean about the actual mechanism of action? Like, is it just coincidence that we're getting roughly the same effect size, or is it because they're kind of working through common mechanisms that are not as unique to the intervention as we might think they are? And so asking these types of questions early in the process can save a lot of work later, unwinding interventions, unpacking them or dismantling them. And so, I think just visualizing this idea that when we're doing efficacy research, we're intentionally skipping over all of this information in the middle, and we're just getting this kind of relatively crude signal, ideally at a population level. And so you want to do these studies in much larger samples, in order to get a signal on this outcome while bypassing all of these kind of intermediate variables. If we start the mechanistic discovery process kind of early in the treatment development process, we can ask these questions about what is accounting for the intervention's effect, and then we can start to build that in intentionally into the treatment development process. And so what that might ultimately look like are, in the context of music interventions, are interventions that are kind of from the beginning tailored to certain populations, as opposed to blasted out and then sort of unwound down the line to try to figure out who is going to get the biggest benefit, in what dose, et cetera. And so we can think of this sort of research existing on a continuum. And as Mathieu pointed out earlier, the majority of studies so far have been on the kind of left side of this continuum, from efficacy to mechanism. When we are designing these studies, beyond just kind of asking the question of, is it going to help patients, or what is the active ingredient, right? That's going to be your sort of motivating principle in deciding whether you're going to conduct an efficacy or a mechanism study. Focusing on what's the appropriate control condition here. With an efficacy study, yes, you do want the control to be generally matched to the active condition, although that's not a prerequisite. And we see lots of kind of I would say lower rigor efficacy studies that use usual care, and often actually we'll see that. I shouldn't necessarily say lower rigor, but in pragmatic trials, you're going to be offering up essentially an efficacy signal with typically a usual or standard care comparison. Whereas, as Mathieu mentioned, in depth, we want our control conditions in mechanistic research deliberately to be attention matched, and also to be thinking about kind of what mechanism are we controlling for. Coming out of, just to give you a concrete example, in our work outside of the music space, so we do meditation research, and one of the approaches that we study focuses on training individuals to attend to positive emotional thoughts and feelings as they arise in the body and the mind throughout the course of a meditation. And so when we come up with a control for that, we want to be controlling not just for the time that they're spending kind of meditating, and maybe the interaction that they're getting with a guide or an instructor, but we want to be controlling for, like, what is it that we're doing in the active condition. They're attending to something where they're focusing their attention on an emotional stimulus, and so we wouldn't want the control condition to then kind of also involve that level of attention. And so we can design our control condition to be time matched, to have the interventionist working with the person, but then we could choose some other process, that doesn't rely on cognition to take over. And so in our case, we use a breath-focused meditation as a control, and this stems from Fadil Zidan's work, and really kind of nicely pits the attention-focused element of our active meditation against a meditation that slows someone down but really doesn't deal with the attention. So that's kind of a concrete example of what we're thinking about in mechanistic and based research for choosing a control condition. The kind of desire is to get to a confirmed causal pathway, or as close as you can in your mechanistic work. Whereas that's really just not the goal of efficacy work. In efficacy work, you're generally just trying to improve outcomes, right? The next step of an efficacy trial is then typically going to be dissemination. Like, you get the big signal from an efficacy trial, and if it beats out placebo, then you're poised to move to thinking about how do we get this out to as many people as possible. Whereas in mechanistic research, the next step actually could be moving to an efficacy trial. So like, just, you would establish a mechanism and then you move directly to an efficacy trial. Or I think more and more what we're seeing is that you establish mechanism and you move then toward a precision medicine type trial, which is going to be kind of more constrained than a general efficacy trial. You can still be targeting efficacy in those precision medicine trials, but you might be doing it in a circumscribed group or set of groups, or in a particular context that wouldn't be feasible in a very large efficacy trial. So I think Mathieu kind of addressed this kind of hierarchy pretty nicely, that when we're choosing a control condition, we want to be kind of reaching toward that the top end of this pyramid with a matched, attention-matched active control. And we can see, the lowest level of evidence is going to come from a silence or usual care control. So that's kind of typically where we are with that. But we also, in thinking about control conditions, we want to be thinking about dose, just like we would in designing an active condition. And so I think really all of the considerations that come up when you're thinking of your active intervention condition, I think should be similarly applied when thinking about controls. And so this would apply to thinking about the duration of the intervention. Are we going to be administering sort of brief bursts, or is it a longer format intervention? Is it something that takes place within just a week or two, or do we draw this out over weeks or months? These are the types of questions that are, you kind of start with the active intervention, and that gives you the foundation for how you're going to design it. But then your control condition needs to also meet those kind of boundaries, or fall within those boundaries. And so if you are testing an 8-session music intervention, it would, of course, then not be appropriate to have your control condition be the provision of a pamphlet or a brief 2 or 3 session intervention. That's going to, if you make that kind of design decision, sometimes it is alluring to make a design decision like that for feasibility of running the trial, or for budgetary reasons, but it's always going to be at the expense of rigor. And so you kind of really want to be thinking about matching on kind of all of these dimensions. So not just attention, as we mentioned earlier, but we're thinking also duration, the frequency of exposure, and then all kinds of other contextual issues that go into delivering these interventions. In the case of music interventions, a consideration like, Are you doing it with headphones or ambient speakers becomes really important. And you're going to want to, uh, uh, you know, tailor your control condition to match what you're doing in the active condition in much the same way. Um, and then finally, we want to be thinking about set and setting. So the mindset of the individual when they're going into a session versus the actual setting in which the session is taking place. And this type of consideration is quite popular. Well, it's a prominent and essential feature of psychedelic trials. And so this slide I pulled from a website kind of discussing psychedelic assisted therapy, but it applies to me equally well in music therapy conditions where, if you fail to account for someone's state of mind when they become exposed to a musical condition, you're missing a ton of information that could be really important for how you evaluate the results. And so we can't always control someone's mindset when they're coming in, but you can do things like prepare a participant for an intervention um, in a way so that you're sort of reducing the likelihood that they're caught off guard by things that they would be exposed to on the day of intervention delivery. And similarly, it may be important in a music intervention that let's say live music is being presented. You might want that live music to be presented in a setting that mirrors a living room. If the goal is for somebody to sort of take the intervention and translate it into their daily life, maybe you want that the setting in which you deliver the music-based intervention to kind of mirror how you would expect people to use this after the intervention is over. These are the types of considerations that are largely overlooked in efficacy trials, but are really important in establishing the kind of mechanism of action that's going on in your study. I think at minimum you want to be measuring these things, and then beyond that, you really can be considering explicitly sort of manipulating these dimensions or curating these dimensions directly into your research design. So I'll pause there and perhaps we can shift now that we've kind of discussed efficacy and mechanisms ad nauseum. Let's take a brief quiz. Fatima, if you can put this up. All right. So I've got three different scenarios here that I'd like you to respond to. So take a couple minutes here, read each scenario, and then indicate whether you think this scenario is referring to a mechanistic study or an efficacy study. So Fatima, when the votes are in, let us know when you've got kind of the majority of or all of the votes in. All right. Fatima, do you want to, maybe we can kind of close the poll now, and and show the results? Okay, fantastic. So let's go through these one by one. So the first one, this is great. We've got some kind of a distribution of responses here, so that makes it fun. So the first one, a trial tests whether music's effect on pain is due to changes in state anxiety measured every 15 minutes during a music therapy session. So this is what we would call a mechanistic kind of clinical trial design. The reason it's mechanistic is we are looking at essentially state anxiety as a mediator. When we say due to changes, that essentially means we're looking at whether changes in state anxiety mediate the effect of music on pain. And we're capturing those kind of state anxiety changes repeatedly in this study. And so that gives us a sense of kind of temporal evolution of that mediator. And there's different ways that you could kind of model that statistically. And in a minute, I'm going to get into some of these kind of statistical considerations at a high level. But this number one would be an example of a mechanistic clinical trial. The second one, patients recovering from lumbar fusion surgery get either a standardized music playlist or standard care. And then opioid use and pain are assessed as outcomes repeatedly over the ensuing week. Okay, so this is a kind of perioperative clinical trial design. The majority of you said efficacy study, and that would be the correct answer in this case. Opioid use and pain are outcomes of surgery. Surgeons are of course interested in reducing pain as a result of lumbar fusion surgery, and opioid use. Mitigating the amount of opioid use would be an important outcome as well. And so you can envision an efficacy trial to see if you play a standardized music playlist versus just a kind of standard care. Again, that would be a very weak control and not appropriate for a mechanistic study, but maybe somewhat appropriate, or at least common in efficacy trials. This is the type of thing that you would see in a standard kind of perioperative efficacy trial. You're measuring the outcome after the surgery, you deliver the intervention beforehand. And in this very brief example, we don't really discuss any potential mechanism that could account for that effect. All right, so that's example of an efficacy trial. And then number three, a trial compares live music therapy, recorded music, and silence. So we've got three intervention conditions in chronic low back pain patients. And then it asks whether clinical pain severity changed and whether dopamine markers changed at post-treatment and 3-month follow-up. Okay, so 64% of you said mechanism, 36% said efficacy. I worded this one kind of trickily in that this is something that would be both a mechanistic study and an efficacy study. And it would really kind of fall into the category of a mechanistic clinical trial that's going to give us an efficacy signal on pain as the outcome, but it's also going to give us mechanistic information on dopamine, right? So we can assess dopamine is not a clinical typically. There are some, I think, unique conditions for which we might consider that a clinical outcome. But in the case of chronic low back pain, dopamine would be a mechanistic measure, whereas clinical pain severity would be a key kind of clinical outcome. And so with a study design where you assess both of these things, you can then get your efficacy signal on the pain outcome and separately measure through statistical analyses whether something like dopamine changes account for the clinical pain severity changes that you see between these music conditions. So that is one where I think both answers are acceptable. And thank you for taking this brief quiz here. So I would like to now move on to addressing some of these kind of statistical considerations that we've alluded to thus far. And I'll talk about three: temporal modeling, mediation, and moderation. And we're just going to review these at a high level, but these are just kind of basic aspects of of statistical frameworks that are common in mechanistic studies, okay? And also have relevance to efficacy studies as well. So when it comes to temporal modeling, this is really important for prediction frameworks. We want to predict whether an exposure at time one leads to changes at some future time. You need kind of a temporal modeling statistical framework, and a single post-intervention time point is not going to be sufficient for kind of modeling how these changes unfold over time. There are ways to kind of nest your observations within people. So, when we gather, in this case, I'm showing a figure from a Kim et al. Study where there were kind of 6 intervention visits. And that allows us to take a look at, for example, what's happening with pain over the course of delivering this intervention. Those observations are nested within the individuals. When we talk about a nested design, we're not simply looking at kind of a pre-post change after delivering this intervention. Rather, we're looking at within individuals and within these groups, do we see changes in pain over the course of delivering the intervention? And that can be really instructive for treatment development. You can imagine, as we see, for example, we actually don't see a real clear signal in this one, but if one of the active conditions was sort of wildly better than the others at an early delivery point, and if that improvement sustained over time, you can visualize that and you can model that statistically, and that might lead you to make a decision, a treatment development decision, to shorten the intervention, right? If you can get the change that you're desiring after 2 sessions, and if that change is sustained over time, then you've kind of delivered a lot of efficiency to the treatment delivery process. And you're not going to know that unless you kind of develop your study design in such a way that allows you to track these changes in a more finely grained way than you would from a traditional efficacy-based pre-post study design. So I think it becomes really important early in the process, again, of treatment development, when you're trying to figure out the dose, especially, you want to be assessing how these changes unfold over the course of the treatment delivery. Another framework that is kind of really helpful in sussing out the kind of temporal dimensions of treatment-related changes is ecological momentary assessment. And you have lots of options there. EMA allows for really dense sampling within people, and it also allows you to kind of develop these bursts over time in your treatment protocols. So kind of a more intensive way to look at this temporal modeling. We can then feed that into a mediation-based framework. Mediation, as Mathieu kind of already alluded to, addresses the question of kind of what accounts for the effects of treatment on your outcome. In an ideal mediation framework, temporal ordering is taken into account. It's not required, though. And so you can develop mediation models that don't rely on kind of temporal precedence or temporal sequencing. But ideally, if you're moving toward a kind of causal inference framework, you really want your mediator to be temporally kind of in between your treatment and your outcome. It's also important to know that you can observe mediation in the absence of a direct effect. And so it could be that you don't see an effect of music on pain intensity, but you do see that if you just look at the direct effect, you don't see that main effect. But when you build a mediation model and you account for a third party variable, sometimes that can explicate a sort of latent direct effect that happens through this kind of mediator that now you're explicitly modeling. And then finally, we can think of moderation as an important kind of mechanistic statistical consideration. Whereas mediation answers the question of what accounts for this kind of treatment effect, moderation answers the question of in whom do we typically see this treatment effect, or when is it optimal to see this treatment effect? Okay, so this is also a mechanistic set of questions. And an example could be, you see an effect as I presented here. This is some data from our lab where we looked at alpha power differences between music and a music condition where we also paired it with pain stimuli. And we see that in healthy controls, if you just look at the red dots, there's kind of no difference between these conditions, whereas in the knee osteoarthritis group, there is a difference between the conditions with the red dots. Without getting into any of the specifics of this study, just looking at the differences, what you can see here is that in healthy folks, you've got one set of effects. In knee osteoarthritis folks, you've got another set of effects. And then you can explicitly model that through a statistical interaction. And it's the difference between these red dots. So the difference between these red dots and the difference under healthy controls and the difference between the red dots among KOA patients, that difference of differences is essentially your interaction effect. Linear regression, a number of statistical frameworks allows for modeling these types of effects. So we are getting to the end of the hour. I do want to allow for some time to answer some questions. So let's turn it over to the audience. Do we have some questions in the Q&A box?
We do. So a question for you is, could you comment on the depth of physiological resolution of the outcome metric you would want to see for mechanistic trials? And they noted, of course, accounting for limitations in what can be done in human participants. I've seen several studies claiming to be mechanistic, but their metrics aren't remotely specific enough, and the conclusions are potentially detrimental to our field. So again, can you comment on the depth of physiological resolution of the outcome metrics you would want to see for mechanistic trials?
Great question. Mathieu, do you have initial thoughts?
Yeah, so, well, as Patrick mentioned, there's a continuum between purely mechanistic studies and more efficacy-based studies. So we'd like to have the bar as much as possible to the right towards as mechanistic as possible. So I think that I would try to answer the question by saying, as much depth as is possible in human participants. That said, we also have to take, a practical decision what to include as a mechanistic research for our pilot funding grant competition. And in that case, I think that so far we've been more open to studies that are maybe a little bit less mechanistic, as long as there is a mechanistic component, as long as the study is designed to answer mechanistic questions. So a question about, how does music reduces pain? We would consider it as a mechanistic study, and we would consider it for funding.
Great. Yeah. I don't really have anything to add to that. I think yeah, I'd be curious to know what, the example of sort of what led to harm there, because that was kind of an interesting take. But uh, perhaps we can move on to the next question, and then if there's an opportunity after to discuss, I'd be curious about that.
And I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A, but I would encourage people to type those in if you have one. We are at the top of the hour.
Yeah.
Um,
Maybe
but
just
go
feeding on
ahead.
Sherry real quick, then if there's no other questions, just to add on to that, I can imagine, I think we need to be careful in uh, drawing conclusions in human-based mechanistic research simply because we have a sort of quote unquote objective outcome or a biological outcome. And I think a good example can be, pet imaging gives us, you know, uh, a look at what's happening in some specific neurotransmitter system. Um, but if you start to look under the hood of what PET neuroimaging really tells us, the actual kind of granularity is relatively low, certainly compared to what we get from animal studies that are, for example, using optogenetics going directly into a circuit. With PET imaging, we're getting a kind of coarse view of what's happening with binding at synapses within a particular neurotransmitter system. And so we want to go, I think, echoing what Mathieu said, we want to kind of go as far as we can with the available tools we have, but we also should be careful to not overinterpret the implications of the mechanisms that we're studying, you know, particularly if there are limits to what they can sort of the explanatory reach within humans.
Great. And I don't know if anyone on the panel can answer this question, but will there be a further opportunities to apply for the U24 RFA beyond the next and last deadline? Has funding been extended or will it be renewed? I know Yoka is no longer on the line, but I don't know, Patrick or Mathieu, if you're aware.
I'm sorry, I don't have that information on the top of my head. Maybe Fatima knows,
Yeah,
but
me either. I would say that's a great question. And if you do not have something kind of that will be ready for the August 3rd LOI, but you think you might have something after that, I would encourage you to reach out to any of us or particularly Yoka. And just, we're available to have these conversations offline. And I can't say it could be that it's just a hard no, that's the end of it, or it could be that there's some wiggle room after that. I think that's sort of a grants administration related issue.
Well, thanks so much for today's webinar and for being in conversation with everyone today. And thank you for attending. We hope you'll join us again for future webinars. Have a great day, everybody.